In the thin, icy air of the Himalayas, where most people wouldn't survive a single week, a young Australian vanished for 43 days and lived to tell the tale. How did James Scott, armed with little more than determination and a strange prophecy, defy certain death in a place experts called unsurvivable? Let's uncover the secrets behind one of the most astonishing survival stories ever recorded. To understand James Scott's ordeal, it helps to know who he was before. James wasn't a thrill seeker. He was a top medical student at the University of Queensland in September 1990, known for both his academic excellence and deep compassion. He wrote to a hospital in Kathmandu, Nepal, then considered one of the world's least developed countries, hoping to complete his medical elective by serving those in need. Months passed with no reply, but James stayed determined. A year later, he bought a ticket to Nepal and persuaded his friend Tim Hooper to join him. Just before their departure, the hospital finally responded. They accepted him for a placement starting in December 1991. At 22, everything seemed to be falling into place. James wasn't just smart, he was physically exceptional. A black belt in karate, he had won his weight class in the Queensland Championships and placed third nationally in 1989. He was also a passionate bushwalker and cyclist. Yet despite his fitness, he had a fear of heights which ruled out climbing Himalayan peaks. Arriving in Nepal months early, James used the time to explore. Locals admired his fitness and suggested he trek in the Himalayas before starting work at the hospital. True to his cautious and methodical nature, he accepted with careful planning. Do you believe that James's journey to Nepal was destiny, determination, or both? Why? Comment and chat with me. They chose the Jamsam Trail, a week-long route through forests, gorges, and mountains. Expecting harsh weather, they packed heavy winter gear, hired 2 porters and a guide. But the weather was milder than expected. Other trekkers wore light clothes, making James and Tim feel over-prepared. Confident, they sent their guide and porters back to Kathmandu and shipped most gear home, keeping only essentials. The rest of the trek went smoothly, and they returned proud and ready for a tougher challenge. For their next adventure, they picked the more difficult Helambu Trail, this time in late December. Instead of packing more, they packed less. James's gear was minimal, and they lacked updated maps and safety tools. At the first lodge, they met German trekkers who shared a newer map. It showed the tougher Gosang Kun Trail branching from Helambu. Excited by the challenge, James and Tim decided to change routes. The next day they met Mark, a solo Australian hiker, and invited him along. But early in the trek, Tim hurt his leg. Though James offered to turn back, Tim insisted they continue without him. In their hasty goodbye, 2 key mistakes occurred. James accidentally gave Tim the new map, and Tim forgot to return their only lighter. Now James and Mark were heading deeper into the mountains, without a map or fire-starting gear, just as winter storms began to set in. James and Mark spent their first night camping at 10,000 feet, struggling to breathe in the thin air. Still, they stayed positive and planned to reach the Gosang Kun Trail at Therapati. The next day looked good. Trekkers said the trail was hard but clear of snow, giving them confidence to move on. But the following morning, light snow had fallen, and clouds covered the peaks. They asked the lodge keeper if more snow was coming. He said no, and assured them the pass was safe. Trusting him, they set off at 7:30. For the first 90 minutes, the weather was calm, and the views were great. Then the weather turned. The temperature dropped, thick clouds rolled in, and heavy snow began. Within minutes, 5 inches covered the trail, making it hard to see or follow. James, trained in medicine, felt they were in real danger and wanted to turn back. But before he could say so, they got separated by a creek in the whiteout. They couldn't see each other and yelled through the storm. After 15 tense minutes, they finally reunited. James urged retreat. There was no map, no trail, and worsening weather. But Mark insisted on continuing, believing he knew the way. Unable to agree, they split up. Mark pushed ahead, and James returned to the lodge. That choice would shape their fate, as each faced the harsh Himalayan winter alone. As James began his solo return, a blizzard quickly erased the trail. Snow fell so heavily that he couldn't see more than 30 feet. Lost in a deadly mountain range, he stayed calm and checked his old map. It showed a creek that led to the town of Talu. So he followed it downstream, hoping it would guide him to safety. For 4 hours, he struggled through rough terrain as the valley narrowed. Then the creek ended at a 100-foot waterfall. He couldn't climb down and was too lost to go back. With no other option, he decided to climb the rock face beside the falls, hoping to rise above the storm and wait it out. The 2-hour climb was terrifying. The icy wall was steep, slippery, and dangerous. He clung to narrow ledges, knowing one slip could kill him. At the top, he collapsed in exhaustion. Luckily, he found a rocky overhang that blocked the wind and snow. Using his medical knowledge, he stripped off his wet clothes, dried off with a towel, and stayed dry inside his sleeping bag. He knew staying dry was vital to survive the cold. That night, James had no idea this small shelter would be his home for the next 43 days. On his first morning under the rock, James saw only snow. The trail was gone, and he was alone in a frozen wilderness. With just 2 chocolate bars, his top concern became water. He melted snow in his mouth to stay hydrated. Staying dry was just as critical. Every night he removed wet clothes, dried off and put on dry layers to prevent hypothermia. At first he tried to escape. He waded through waist-deep snow but made little progress. Each failed attempt drained his energy and made it clear these mountains wouldn't let him go easily. As days turned to weeks, hunger and isolation took a toll. He craved food constantly and dreamed of big meals. But he relied on his karate training to stay focused. By mentally practicing moves and techniques, he distracted himself from hunger and fear. "I lost about 25 kilograms, James later said. My body ate itself, but I had snow for water, strong faith, and the will to spare my loved ones grief." His discipline and belief in seeing his family again kept him going. But his body was failing. By week 2, his lips were cracked, his throat infected, and ulcers made eating painful. He lost muscle, and his ribs became visible. The worst was his feet. They turned deep blue from the cold. He tested them with a medical tool, and blood came out, but he felt nothing. The frostbite had killed the nerves. Fearing he wouldn't survive, James wrote a goodbye letter to his family, filled with love and regret. He tucked it into his backpack, expecting it would be found with his body. Lying in his sleeping bag, he thought it was the end. But the most surreal and terrifying parts of his journey were still ahead. James's isolation was taking a deep mental toll. After weeks alone with only wind and his breathing for company, his sense of time and reality began to blur. He often couldn't tell if he was dreaming or awake. One afternoon he was jolted by a chilling sound, horrifying animal screams echoing through the valley below. He jumped up and looked out from his rocky shelter. About 100 feet away, a bush shook violently. Moments later, a massive Himalayan black bear stepped into view. It had sensed his presence. James and the bear locked eyes. He froze, knowing any movement might provoke an attack. But instead of fear, a darker thought crept in. If the bear attacked, his suffering would end quickly. Weeks of cold, starvation, and pain had worn him down. He reached for his dissection scissors, not to defend himself, but in resignation. Then in desperation, he screamed at the bear, daring it to come closer. He was ready for it to end. But the bear, startled by this unexpected reaction, fled up the slope and vanished into the rocks. James collapsed, overwhelmed by the encounter. He realized just how close he had come to giving up. But the bear was not gone for good. For the next 5 nights, James heard it circling his camp. Sometimes it paced above his overhang, sometimes below. Each night James lay awake, gripping the scissors, bracing for an attack that never came. This ongoing fear became a new kind of torment. The bear's presence was a silent threat, haunting him through the night. The constant tension paired with his weakening body pushed James to the edge. The psychological strain became nearly unbearable, as he waited night after night for a predator that might strike at any moment. If you were stranded like James, what would be your survival mindset? Drop your wildest survival strategy in the comments. While James struggled to survive in the mountains, his family in Brisbane faced their nightmare. On December 29th, 5 days after James was due to meet Tim for Christmas Eve dinner in Kathmandu, his sister Joanne got devastating news. Tim had sent a fax to James's parents. James was missing in the Himalayas. Joanne was shocked. She wanted to fly to Nepal immediately, but the Australian Foreign Affairs Department advised her to stay in Australia. They urged her to contact Carl Harrison, a mountaineering expert in Kathmandu, who could organize a proper search. She agreed, but waiting helplessly at home was agonizing. The next day, Carl and his team began the search, while the family clung to hope. Days passed with no updates. Joanne hoped each phone call would bring good news, that James was simply delayed at a lodge. But no such call came. Then on January 2, 1992, there was a breakthrough. French-Canadian trekkers had reported seeing a solo hiker matching James's description. Officials were almost certain it was him. Joanne felt huge relief and quickly shared the news with her parents. For a moment it seemed their nightmare might end. But as more time passed with no word from James himself, the weight grew harder to bear. Despite strong warnings from the Australian government, Joanne made a crucial decision. On January 3rd, she applied for a visa to Nepal. 4 days later, she flew to Kathmandu to join the search for her brother. With her was James's best friend, Andrew Ross, who also refused to wait idly. Together they raised $70,000 from loved ones and strangers to fund a full rescue mission. Dead or alive, James had to be somewhere, Joanne later said. The only thing worse than finding a body was finding nothing. By the time she arrived, James had been missing for 16 days. Official searches had failed, blocked by snowstorms and difficult terrain, but Joanne brought relentless determination. She chased every lead, checked all sightings, and pushed searches into areas others had ruled out. Her resolve became the driving force behind the mission to find James. As days passed with no results, Joanne grew desperate. She remembered something a local woman had told her at the airport on her first day in Kathmandu. The woman suggested she consult a Buddhist lama, claiming lamas could see what others could not. At first Joanne dismissed the idea, but when all other searches failed, she decided to try. Meeting the lama was unlike anything she had known. She shared James's story and showed him a map of the region. The lama prayed in silence, then placed his finger on a spot inside a triangle formed by the towns of Fedi, Gopte, and Talu. He said the search should focus there. Experts doubted anyone could reach that remote area. It was far from where teams had been looking. Still, the lama insisted James would be found there. When Joanne asked if her brother was alive, the lama gave a calm, hopeful answer. "You will see your brother again." Those words gave her strength as the search faced more obstacles in the days ahead. By day 30, James's body was near collapse. His ribs showed through thin skin, his face was hollow, and he looked barely alive. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure of time, trapped under his rocky shelter. He had begun to accept that he might die there. Then he heard something, helicopter rotors in the distance. At first he thought it was another hallucination, but the sound grew louder. It was real. James pushed himself up and stumbled toward a clearing. Weak and unsteady, he waved his sleeping bag overhead. Desperate, he pulled down his pants to reveal bright red thermal underwear, his most visible item. The helicopter, about 6 miles away, moved in a search pattern. James waved and jumped, using all his remaining strength to be seen. He felt certain this was his rescue, but the aircraft circled, then turned and flew away. The sound faded until silence returned. Something broke inside James. His hope, built over weeks of suffering, collapsed. He fell face first into the snow and sobbed. For the first time, he truly believed he would not survive. The pain of being seen yet left behind pushed him to the edge. He began to question if he could go on. On what James believed was day 42 in the mountains, he again heard the sound of helicopter rotors. This time, he knew it might be his last chance. Weak and near death, he dragged himself out of his sleeping bag and into a clearing, waving it overhead. Unlike the first helicopter, this one flew directly over him, circling tightly. James could see figures inside studying the ground, studying him. For 20 minutes he waved with all his remaining strength before collapsing in the snow. The helicopter eventually flew away, but James was certain this time. They had seen him. He also knew rescue on foot could take 3 to 4 days. Given his condition, he wasn't sure he'd survive that long. Back in Kathmandu, Joanne Robertson waited by the radio, as she had every day. Then, the call came. "We have found James, and he is alive." The rescuer repeated it twice, knowing how hard it was to believe. James had survived 42 days in conditions where most wouldn't last 10. Overcome with emotion, Joanne could barely respond. After weeks of fearing the worst, it was almost too much to take in. The helicopter returned to organize the rescue. Carl Harrison and his team prepared to trek into dangerous, snow-covered terrain. Nothing would stop them now. High in the mountains, James lay in his sleeping bag, fading in and out of consciousness. Then he heard something he thought impossible: human voices. At first he believed it was a hallucination, but the voices grew clearer. Using his last bit of strength, he whistled. A whistle came back. In that moment, James knew his 43-day nightmare was finally over. When James heard the whistle reply, he sat up with a burst of energy. The sound was real, human voices coming closer. He shouted with what little voice he had left. Then came the crunch of boots on snow. After 43 days alone, help had arrived. 2 rescuers appeared and looked into his shelter. One called out, "Are you James Scott from Australia?" James whispered, "Yes." The rescuers rushed in, hugging him, kissing his forehead, and crying. These experienced mountain rescuers were overcome with emotion. One looked into James's eyes and said, "You are a god." When James asked why, the rescuer explained, "No one has ever survived here for more than 10 days. You have lasted 43. They quickly assessed his condition. He was alive but critically weak. They radioed for a helicopter and set up shelter, beginning careful medical care. That night they stayed with him, kept him warm, and monitored his fragile state. They gave him tiny sips of food and liquid, knowing anything more could harm him after weeks of starvation. The next morning, James heard the sound he had dreamed of for 43 days, a helicopter coming to rescue him. But the terrain was dangerous, and he was too weak to move on his own. The team secured him in a special mountain rescue harness. Every movement hurt. His muscles had wasted away, and his joints were stiff from weeks of cold and stillness. As the helicopter hovered above, James was slowly lifted from the rocky ledge that had kept him alive and nearly killed him. The feeling of rising after so long in one place was surreal. During the flight, he looked down at the vast, snowy mountains that had nearly claimed his life. From above, his shelter looked like a tiny dark speck in a sea of white. It was a miracle they had seen him at all. At the helicopter landing pad, Joanne waited, torn between hope and fear. She knew James was alive but did not know what shape he would be in after 43 days in the Himalayas. The strong, healthy man who had left Australia was now a frail survivor. When the helicopter landed, rescuers and medics stepped out, helping a thin figure walk. Joanne barely recognized her brother. James had lost about 25 kilograms. His face was hollow, his beard wild, and his skin pale. Dark circles ringed his eyes and every step was slow. But when he saw Joanne, something lit up inside him. He walked toward her with all the strength he had left. Joanne ran to him, and they embraced, a moment of joy and heartbreak. "Thank you," James whispered. "I can't believe you are here." His words held gratitude, amazement, and relief that his nightmare was over. Joanne quickly called their father in Australia. "It's Joanne," she said. "I've found James, and he's alive." She heard her father repeat the news to their mother, followed by sobs of relief. After weeks of fear, the Scott family finally had the miracle they had prayed for. James was taken to Patan Hospital in Kathmandu, where doctors were stunned he had survived. His vital signs were weak, his weight dangerously low, and there were serious concerns about damage from frostbite, malnutrition, and exposure. The biggest worry was his feet, which had suffered severe frostbite. Amputation was considered, but doctors chose to wait, hoping circulation would return with treatment and gradual warming. James spent 11 days in the hospital. His recovery was slow and delicate. His body had to relearn how to eat, digest, and regain strength. Remarkably, his condition improved. His feet healed enough to avoid amputation. With therapy, his strength and weight returned. Still, James faced lasting effects. He had coordination issues from nerve damage, and his vision was permanently affected. But considering the conditions he endured, these were seen as minor. Incredibly, when rescuers confirmed his exact location, it matched the triangular area the Buddhist Lama had pointed to on the map, proving the Lama's guidance was unexpectedly accurate. Inspired by this true story of grit and hope, give this video a like and subscribe. It helps more people find stories that remind us what humans are capable of. News of James Scott's survival quickly spread worldwide. His story, marked by extreme endurance, family devotion, mystical guidance, and an incredible rescue, captivated global media. Within days, James became the center of intense attention. To manage the coverage, the family enlisted PR expert Harry M. Miller. The story was sold to a television network for $250,000. But instead of keeping the money, the Scott family chose integrity. Joanne's mother had tracked all donations received during the search. Using their share, they refunded donors. Those who declined were honored by having their contributions sent to Patan Hospital in Kathmandu, where James had been treated. This ethical decision reflected the same character that drove James's dream of helping underserved communities through medicine. 3 decades later, Dr. James Scott reflects on how those 43 days changed him. The experience reshaped his outlook on life, resilience, and hope. He completed medical school and became a child and youth psychiatrist, a path directly inspired by his survival. James often draws from his ordeal when supporting young patients. He believes deeply in the power of time, support, and perspective to overcome even the darkest moments. "If you give things time to sort out," he once said, "they generally do." His Himalayan experience gave him first-hand insight into suffering and recovery. During his worst days, he found strength by thinking of others who had endured worse: war prisoners, burn victims, and forgotten patients. This perspective shaped both his personal philosophy and professional practice. James's story became more than a tale of survival. It stood as proof of the power of family, faith, and mental endurance. Joanne's unwavering efforts, from ignoring government warnings to seeking the guidance of a Buddhist Lama, were pivotal to his rescue. The Lama's insight, once doubted, proved astonishingly accurate. James was found exactly where the Lama had pointed on the map, reminding the world that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. Ultimately, James's survival showed what is possible when hope, discipline, and the will to live come together. He endured 43 days in conditions believed to be unsurvivable beyond 10, defying both nature and expectation. In the end, James Scott's survival in the Himalayas wasn't just about one man's fight against the elements. It was about the power of love, faith, determination, and the miraculous ways that hope can manifest even in the most desperate circumstances. It remains to this day one of the most incredible survival stories ever recorded in the world's most challenging mountains. Thanks for being with us. Leave a comment, like to show your support, and remember to hit that subscribe button for more exciting videos. See you next time.